Welcome everybody to this amazing series on Trans Insight, an exploration of the borderlands and spirituality and experience of gender. And I am really proud to be introducing Dr. Ben Bader, an associate professor of history at the University of Manitoba. Before I get into his bio, I'm just going to tell you that Ben and I have been comrades and friends and spiritual chevrutot for more than 7 years, I think, at this point. And his depth and his sensitivity and his spiritual journey have been an incredible resource for me personally, but also for the queer community. He was recently asked to join a series by Alan Slomowitz called Homosexuality, Transsexuality, Psychoanalysis, and Traditional Judaism, which is a hell of a title for a book. And he wrote an incredible poem about the spiritual journey, some of which we're going to hear kind of, I think, opened up in this series. And I'm going to just share with you, before I read his bio, something at the end of this piece that's just touching and moving. And he says, living across genders is disorienting and frightening. It means vulnerability and pain. It can mean shame, rejection, even violence. But it is also a ray of light across an abyss. It means trusting the song more than the instrument. It means that gender is shimmering with promise. It means that gender has exhilarating richness and beauty in a universe that's alive, and that gender indeterminacy radiates with the contingency of the divine. If that doesn't give you an introduction to the power of this, of our presenter, then I'm not sure anything will. He's just an incredible, both intellectual and spiritual guide, and I hope that these 3 sessions strike you as they have, as they, I'm sure, will me, of the significance of this particular perspective on transgender identity and gender itself for this moment. Ben Bader is an associate professor of history at the University of Manitoba. He also headed Judaic studies there for a few years. He teaches, writes lectures on European history, Jewish history, historiography, gender studies, feminist theory. He grew up in post-World War II Germany, and there he transitioned from female to male when he finished his PhD dissertation at Columbia University on gender and Judaism in the 19th century and in Germany. And he co-edited a volume on masculinities in German Jewish history, and is concluding a work on the theorizing of Jewishness with the Toolkit of Gender Theory. He's a member of a modern Orthodox shul in Winnipeg, and Daniel Thal Elf, who's I think joining us today, wrote a play on Orthodox trans identity inspired by Ben. The play is called Narrow Bridge and is scheduled to open in Winnipeg, April 2021. Thank you so much, Ben, for being with us, and I cede the stage, the rest of the hour to you.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that generous introduction and for reading this beautiful piece from my published text. And thanks everyone for coming out here in the middle of the day, and it's just a huge pleasure. So let me say a little bit. Let me see, should we start with sharing screen? So yeah, so this is the agenda for today. So I'm a little bit of an introduction to the 3 sessions. Then I'm just a few comments on this moment in time, gender the term, gender 3 theories, and then we get into the thick of it, some basics on postmodern thought, queer theory, gender coherence. Let's see how much gender and Jewishness we get to, and then the big question, how real is gender? So in some ways, at least part of today's session are going to be the most general and the most scholarly, and I really like us to think a little and introduce you, if you want, to my thinking about gender theory. And so not so much, we're also going to, I mean, it's going to be obvious like later in the session then how this connects to transgender and trans experience, but it is much more general, this, you know, the question, what is gender and how does gender work? And well, if I may say already, there is no answer, at least not one answer, and that in my thinking, in my experience, this is really part of why, you know, what is so awesome about gender. So next week then is going to be very, very different. It's going to be heavily autobiographical, a little poetic, sort of talking about how my gender journey, my way into orthodoxy, my awareness of divine presence, my experience of light, how all of this I experience as connected, and how I'm, you know, trying to cultivate this today, how I got here and how I'm trying to cultivate this. We also, you know, also this text that Steve just mentioned, you know, so I'm, you know, I'm asking, we agreed that he's going to send it out, and then you can, I mean, you can, you know, have a look at it, but certainly don't feel, you know, you're not, it's, you're not required at all to read it before next time, but you will have the opportunity to do so. And then really the third session, we're going to see where we go. I'd like to have most of all a conversation talking about community, about trans experience in the Orthodox world. Yeah, there's really not too much. And, you know, if there's anything also by the time that you like us to you want me or us to discuss, then please also be in touch. Before I start, really, I just like to make a few comments about this moment in time before we sort of move into the theory of things, if you want. So we've just moved a few days into Elul, which is a time of great transparency, a time of particular intimacy with the divine, a time when the fabric of light that underlies all creation is radiant in a special and sweet way, and a time when the veils that filter this radiance are a little thinner, a little more fragile than usual. Secondly, we are in the middle of this pandemic. It's a time of rupture. The surface of the reality in which we tend to live has been ripped open. There's tremendous suffering, fear, uncertainty. And of course, we know that the reality that we usually experience as reliable, so, I mean, we know that the reality that we usually experience as reliable and predictable is an illusion, but we have a much more of a sense of this now. So in some ways, what we currently experience is an opening in what we might call the cosmic contingency behind all existence, the fragility, which is frightening and awesome. And this, for me, this is connected to gender. And as you're going to see, I'm going to argue the surface of gender and gender coherence is an illusion. And I say that gender is a fabric of light, awesome, utterly ephemeral, fragile, impermanent, and yet more real and more powerful than the material world. So let me now sort of jump into the gist of things. Just like as a little reminder, we have already arrived here at gender, the term. Does anyone know where the term gender comes from. So see if I know. So in the
No idea.
no idea. So the way we use gender now has been introduced or sort of mischievously made up, created, invented by feminist theories in the 1970s. So before then, no idea. The term gender was strictly used in linguistics. The gender of words, the gender in linguistics, in grammatics. The grammatical gender, I mean, in English you don't have this, but certainly we have it in Hebrew, the gender of terms. So that is already kind of gives you a sort of an inkling about what we're talking about. We're talking about language, we're talking about the abstract, we're talking about the realm of the symbolic. So gender as when sort of feminists felt the need to have a word, to have a for something that is not sex, that is not biological sex, that is not, but about the whole sort of the whole symbolic system of this ordering between what seemed to be this dyad of men and women. And another comment I like to make is, and as I'm now really moving a little into this introduction to gender theory, the scholarship on gender theory is, it started in the 1970s in any significant way, is just a comment saying that the framework and the original impetus was feminist, and really based on the question like, why is there this inequality between men and women that seems to be really pervasive in most cultures and societies? Why is there, how do we explain gender hierarchy? And of course, the agenda was, we want to understand how this comes into existence, this unequal ordering, and we want to understand it, explain it, and ultimately undo it. So undo women's persistent inferiority, invisibility, marginal status in almost all cultures. So that was really the agenda of gender theory. And there were three theoretical answers, or really there have been three theoretical answers. The first are theories of patriarchy that are, by their nature, transhistorical, static, and not very useful. So for this feminist agenda, and also intellectually not incredibly interesting. The second approach, the second theoretical approach was Marxist, which has some, there's some elements that are interesting, that I find convincing. I mean, most famously, one of my favorite books, actually, Engels' The Origin of the Family, Property and the State, that basically argues at the moment, sort of in prehistoric society, at the moment when private property was invented, was introduced, when somebody sort of came along and staked up, a piece of land, and started to be interested, and a man did this and started to be interested to inherit, sort of to hand on this property to his children. He needed to have power over his, over a woman, over his wife, to know that this would be really, sort of his descendants who would be inheriting this piece of land. So basically, so an explanation that ties sort of the gender system to private property. I don't want to go much more into this. Ultimately, it does not. This theory does not sufficiently explain the workings of gender in then fully developed capitalism, also in socialist societies. And most importantly, if you want to say, so it is clear that gender and gender systems have an independent existence, outside of and are not only a function of economic conditions and economic mechanisms. So within Marxist theory, gender has no independent analytical status. It remains sort of a kind of subsumed a function of economic explanations. So for feminist theory, that was also not sufficient. The third theoretical approach, and that is really the one that remains central until today, is psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis basically presents a narrative about how gender and gender hierarchy comes into existence. Gender comes into existence in this narrative in a linguistic process, a process that is based on language during childhood. A child is sort of introduced into the symbolic order of the world, and in sort of a story, or there's a story of infantile development, in sort of a history of identifications, and in the course of this develops sexual orientation and gender identity. So, I mean, this is based, of course, on Freud, but the person who fine-tuned this and developed this very much in terms of gender theory was Jacques Lacan, French psychoanalyst. Jacques Lacan lived from 1901 to 1981. So, according to Lacan, difference and like all difference, but also particularly for gender difference is the foundation, the reified foundation of all culture. This sort of the gender is part of the symbolic order of human society. And I mean, both Freudian and also then Lacanian understanding, this is a closed story. This is a closed story how a boy and a girl come into existence. It's a story about a sort of a normative, healthy development at which end the end result of which are heterosexual men and women. But of course, what this offers is so it is the opportunity that there is a state before this. So it's not, it is something that is both sort of society and culture. It's a system that humans have created, that society and culture has created. And it is a system that is sort of recreated every time sort of a human is born and is growing up. And it is, and while certainly Freud and Lacan very much, for them, this normative story was the healthy and necessary story. It of course leaves space for the imagining or the rereading and the sort of intervening, the potentially intervening, the rethinking of this of the symbolic order. And actually, by first of all French feminists, but then really also American and also feminist theory. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. So so it is about a symbolic order, and just one aspect of this that it sort of shows that shows sort of the symbolic quality is, so Lacan talks about the law of the father, about the sort of, that is this hierarchical symbolic universe. And he makes a distinction, he made a distinction between the penis and the phallus, whereby the penis is the real thing of flesh and blood, and phallus is a symbolic center of power. So, so we have a theory now that does not conflate these two, but that, and it's not about sort of the decisive move is not the physical materiality, but is the sort of the positioning of a human in this symbolic order towards the law of the father and the law and male power. So it is about not anatomy, not body parts, not appearance, but about the meaning that is given to materiality and appearance. Here, one of my favorite writings from Lacan is a text called the Mirror Stage, where he sort of talks about how a small child, sort of for the first time, you know, there's a stage where a child looks into the mirror and actually sees something, sees themselves. And that is when sort of identity starts to come into existence, where when a child sort of becomes a person, starts having a sense of themselves, which is of course fascinating because it's in the mirror. So in order to sort of gain a sense of selfhood, you need to be reflected. You sort of engage with your reflection in the mirror. So you also have the sense of sort of it's removed. It's not direct. The very sense of self. You know, you engage with something that is actually not your physical self, but this reflection.
I want to stop for 1 second. It's like, in other words, that identity is born when you see what others see. Because you looking through your eyes don't ever see yourself.
Right.
But when you see yourself mirrored, then for the first time you understand that you are being seen by others and that what they see now. So there's something it's social about this as well.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's all social. I mean, social, well, symbolic social in the sense that there is no gender outside of this symbolic system, outside of this, you know, making sense, making meaning, creating meaning in this, you know, interaction with your reflection, interaction with,
Right.
you know, it is not, there's no, and it's also and you know, I'm going to take you a little further. So when and maybe here just sort of a personal comment. So when I read this and when I started to read queer theory, which is the next thing we are going into in a moment, that sort of blew my mind in some way. So I was a lesbian studying feminist theory at Columbia University more than 30 years ago. And here I was reading Lacan and then Judith Butler. And it said, the body is not the site of truth about gender. This is not how gender comes into existence, but gender is a symbolic system. If this is the case, I knew I'm not a woman. And so it's, and before I'd like us to now take the next step into queer theory. But before I do this, I'm actually not, let's just see, just in case this is useful. No, here we are. this is a quote by John Scott, who is a historian and for gender history. This is a very crucial quote. It's so she based on Lacan. She came up with a statement: gender is or summarized her insights as gender is a constitutive element of social relationships based on the perceived differences between the sexes. And then gender is a primary way of signifying relationships of power. Yes, it's always about power too. So it is the perceived differences between the sexes. I mean, it's similar to the, like in the mirror stage, is what we think we see and the meaning that we give to the physicality that we see in the mirror. And the mirror is you and, I mean, it's you to yourself, and it is the whole sort of the whole universe of meaning that a society gives to individual, collective, all social relationships, and all social relationships. Anything social, anything that's interactive between humans is always gendered. Gender is always a constitutive element based on, you know, what we think is physicality. Let me move on here. Like here we are, since this is easy now. Okay, gender theory, patriarchy, Marxism, and psychoanalysis. And now we move to this core piece, if you want, postmodern thought, queer theory and gender coherence. In modern Enlightenment thinking, there's one objective reality and one truth. And humans can know this truth. So this is late 18th century Enlightenment, modern, so basics of modernity. Postmodern thinking goes beyond this and postulates that all knowledge, all truth is contingent, created, constantly shifting. Knowledge and truth come into existence when humans engage with the world around them. So, and this is, of course, very similar to how the textual culture of rabbinic Judaism works. There are unlimited new aspects of truth that being created, come into existence, new readings of texts as humans keep engaging with Torah. It is, and these new readings unfold, and then we can, of course, if you like, you know, whether these readings are pre-existent or are pre-existent or come into existence, but they're certainly, it's not, so this is the basics really of postmodern thinking. In terms of gender, this means modern essentialist thinking on gender. So let me go up here, would seem or has really postulated in the past, you know, few hundred years as the sort of normative thinking that there are men and women outside and independent of culture. They sort of exist and we can know them. We take this for granted. This is how it is. Gender scholarship now sort of really based on you know, there's this psychoanalytic theory that I just you know, sort of outlined very briefly, postulates there is no identity, no subjecthood, no experience outside of meaning, language, and symbolic order. All of this comes into existence in this sort of, in this abstract process. There's one other concept that I'd like to introduce you to, before we move into queer theory, which is the concept of performativity, or originally also called speech acts. it's basically, it's the concept that language or utter performative is language or utterances that change or create reality. Like, I declare you married is sort of a classic, you know, you pronounce, you say words that change reality. And of course, Bereshit, let there be light, the 10 utterances, you know, in Bereshit. The idea that there's first language, sort of symbolic, there's a symbolic order that is sort of existing in language, in the symbolic realm, in the abstract realm, I mean, whatever you want to think. And then by being uttered, by gaining, by being sort of manifest as this language manifests in the world, material reality comes into existence. I mean, that is basically the Genesis story. So queer theory now takes all of these insights, what we've just discussed with Lacan, the utterly, yeah, okay, actually put this here. Ideas of sort of the postmodern ontology, postmodern explanation of how being, of the essence of being, how being is, how existence is. And so basically, and going back to Lacan again, saying like, yes, all identifications, all subjecthood is are in their core fantasies. They're sort of, they're invented, they're human, they're made up, they're symbolic reality. And gender is enacted, is symbolic reality. And performativity is the vehicle through which ontological effects are being established. So this performativity is not only language, but is sort of text in the most in an expansive sense. That body language, signs via dress, gestures, haircut, not just language. So any type of all of this is language. All of this, we are communicating by words, but we are communicating in many different ways of text. And and as we are doing this, we create the illusion of existence. So sort of so giving all these different signs, doing these sort of what society understands as male, by performing by uttering the signs of maleness, if you want, in the verbal and non-verbal ways. What comes into existence is a man, a gendered human being, male or a woman. So here gender coherence is the effect of all of these of these things that we do. There's no, it's so basically, and it establishes the truth effect of gender. So the sort of, and in some way it goes really back to Lacan's psychoanalysis, saying, so by doing these symbolic things, we create the illusion, both it's both the illusion and the reality. Because that's reality we know. All reality is created in these ways in which these sort of the accumulation of performativity creates the effect of reality, if you want, including gender reality. Yes.
I guess what I want to put on the table as we move forward, and I know you've got a bit more to do, so it's going to be jam-packed with other ideas, is just the tension is always between physical reality, which does have its experience, but then our conceptualization of it, which is another contending or even challenging or orchestrating experience of the sensibilities. And so I guess my question to you is, what is real and what is imagined or let's say constructed? That the difference between real and constructed is where you're heading us, correct? Like, or in that understanding that, because that's the, you know, the fundamental challenge in the contemporary society, you know, that J.K. Rowling is pointing to is, do we have to trash all materiality for the sake of internal experience, or is there, or no? Indeed, the liberation requires us to deny that materiality has any meaning at all without us. So I think this is the space where there's a lot of conflict. You don't have to deal with it now, but I'm feeling like this is the kernel.
Yes, and let me continue a little bit, because of course this is where I get where I'm headed.
Good.
I just wanted to point out that in what you, if I heard you correctly, you were going back and forth, you were conflating reality and physicality. So that is, you know, we want to just,
right.
Yeah. You know, let me go back just for a moment to this concept of gender coherence. So, and we are, I mean, we are starting to get into the thick of it, because, I mean, basically, Judith Butler now and queer theory talks about how coherence and all coherence, and actually in part of, I mean, I'm not sure how much I'm going to get to this, but this project that I've talked about working on, I've been thinking about how Jewish coherence comes into existence. So it's not only about gender. How does someone, you know, kind of is a Jew become? How is Jewishness being constructed? How is, you know, how do you communicate to the outside world that you're Jewish? Like, what are the practices? What are the signs? What are the, you know, like, what is the, you know, what are the elements? So, but going back to gender, it's basically, you know, these for cis, what we call cis people today, and the languages, you know, I'm sure in 5 years it's going to be completely different. So dress, gesture, haircut, body parts that can be seen, body parts that are usually covered, all of this operate together to create coherence and intelligibility. You know, like, I am hearing you saying and doing these things, and these are all the signs you give me, so I can. So I read you as a woman, and you know, and you seem to be coherent. So for cis people, this process is invisible, and for the most part, it happens without people being aware of it, and without, you know, sort of paying attention to what they're doing. It feels automatic, natural, self-evident. And the dissecting it, like analyzing it the way Judith Butler does, feels odd, artificial, unnecessary, even wrong. Like, why, you know, sort of absurd. But for trans people, this makes a lot of sense. For us, coherence, establishing coherence is a huge deal, and often an enormous struggle to be legible, to be coherent, to read, you know, the different sort of utterances, if you want, the different part of language, the different sort of symbolic messages that for ourselves and for others is huge. And we need to do this in order to establish and have a sense of a self, to have a sense of subjecthood, to sort of establish, in Butler's term, that fiction of coherence, that we that sort of happens for most cis people under the realm of awareness. Since we have sort of, there are different elements for us that clash, and creating coherence, making sense of us, being sort of becoming a person, being legible to ourselves and to the outside world, is a project in the ways in which Judith Butler explains, really. So, you know, so when I talk about myself, I inhabit a place of gender that is neither strictly male nor strictly female, but I'm coherent to myself. I have found a way of making sense of and to myself, and of reading myself in terms of my gender that establishes enough coherence, if you want, enough of a fiction of a unified self, that I can live with some ease and pleasure. So I'm saying there's not only coherent and incoherent, but there are grades of coherence, shades, grades. And to people who interact with me in public, I'm intelligible and fully coherent as a man today. And so when they have not additional information about me, they read me as a man, which works for them. And it works for me because living as a man is part of how I read myself. But it does not, you know, encompass the entire scope of how I think about myself. I'm going to only really name the gender in Jewishness and then move to how real is gender. And if people really like, we can expand on the gender and Jewishness piece. So so there's a lot of theory on you know how does gender work and very little on how does Jewishness work. So I was you know with some colleagues doing this project on using gender theory to think about Jewishness. So and it was fascinating because it brought, of course, new thinking about Jewishness to the fore. But what I'd like to do here, it reflected back on how gender works, right? So it's quite fascinating. And what is really sort of fascinating is how they are both sort of the similarities here. But I want to say Jewishness is also thought about, you know, there's a people. Jews are a people. At the same time, without a set of practices and culture, and it's completely irrelevant. Like the pure physicality of peoplehood, without the culture and the religion and text and you know all other symbolic, meaningless. So I leave it with this. Practices of conversion, very similar, fascinating. Converting from one gender to the other, converting into a people, thinking about, you know, and Jewishness and gender being thought about as something natal, you're born with, you can never get away from. Very different from Christianity. Gender is much more like Judaism than it is like Christianity. You're not sort of having an epiphany and then you're authentically male, I mean, you're female or whatever, right? I say, as in the Christian awakening experience, it is so, you know, and then there's not one origin. There's not one reason. There's so many ways, and through the centuries of being Jewish, there's religion, there's culture, there's peoplehood, there's
language.
There's language, there's you know, secular Zionism, there's, you know, that conversos who return. It's like there is a, and what I'm basically saying, it is not only maybe at the very core of it, the very definition of what Judaism is and what gender is, that it cannot be defined, it cannot be nailed down, it cannot be sort of narrowed, it cannot be into one stable definition. It is this shifting landscape. So I want to just finish up now before we move into the discussion. how real is gender? And they're really two diametrically opposed correct answers. And that is what gender is about. One is not real at all. It has no ontological status outside of the cultural max. Oh, and I actually have here's my last screen. Here we are, share. Here we are. Not real at all. It has no ontological status outside of the cultural matrix that creates it. Seeing it doesn't exist outside of us making it up, outside of the symbolic system that humans create that is, it's entirely abstract, complete fantasy, complete fabrication. It is absolutely air and light. There's nothing, it is not grounded in physicality. It is not a function of your body parts, your anatomy of whatever, Jewish peoplehood, like for Jews. And the second answer, it is extremely real. It's as real as anything else in our lives. It is powerful, lasting, enduring. It inhabits and saturates every aspect of human society and human culture. It's always there. And it's sort of fascinating tennis. I mean, it's just kind of flabbergasting how powerful and how and how much it is similar throughout the centuries in different cultures. I mean, it's absolutely mind-blowing. And I would argue this is not despite, but because it is so flexible, fluid, and multifaceted and elusive. And of course, I mean, this paradise let me think about the nature of divinity in God, whose existence cannot be proven with rational philosophical means. I mean, there's plenty of people have done it over the centuries. So, I mean, I personally haven't been very convinced. But God is radically contingent, present everywhere, in all material and non-material phenomena, never confined to any particular appearance or characteristic, the utter reality that underlies everything while escaping definition. And when we try, I mean, there's a tetragrammaton, and that we call in this double abstraction Hashem. It is, I mean, the very essence of, I mean, I would say the very essence of the most powerful, I don't want to say things, is that they cannot be nailed down, that they are both. It is not, and there's not one answer.
So I'm going to, I'm just going to say that I had goose pimples. That this is what an incredible limud during Elul to encounter the mysterious, elusive nature of both gender and God, and the real in the sense of pervasive and substrate of gender and God that it permeates everything. It's an incredible dichotomy that I'm looking forward to hearing more about. I'm going to just thank you, everybody.